So let's look at our agenda for today. So first of all, I'm going to be giving a quick overview of the National Flood Insurance Program and community responsibilities for participating in this program. I'm assuming if you're on this presentation, your community does participate in the NFIP, but if not, that's fine too. And then after that, I'll go through that substantial improvement definition and talk more about that, and we'll break that down piece by piece. And then I'll turn things over to Jennifer, and she will go step by step through how to make a substantial improvement determination. Then I will be talking about different building scenarios if a building has been determined to be a substantial improvement. And I'll also talk about ways that your community can go beyond minimum NFIP requirements related to substantial improvement as well. Then we'll wrap up with some resources that can help you manage substantial improvement determinations and lots of other resources that we'll be talking about during this webinar. And then, as I said, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the NFIP and community responsibilities. Okay, so the NFIP is a voluntary program that communities can choose to participate in. FEMA manages the program, and we at the state provide support like training, such as this webinar. We answer questions from community officials and others about the NFIP and floodplain management. If a community joins the NFIP, that means they agree to adopt local floodplain regulations and enforce them through a local permitting process. And then also in NFIP communities, flood insurance is available for purchase for anyone in the community. What ties these two together, one of the things is flood mapping, and FEMA does create flood maps for communities in the NFIP, and these maps are used for the purposes of enforcing your floodplain regulations and also flood insurance. Adoption enforcement of the floodplain regulations that meet minimum NFIP requirements is required for a community to remain in good standing in the program. And the substantial improvement provision in your regulations is one of those minimum NFIP requirements. So this slide shows a list of the different responsibilities that a community has when participating in the NFIP. Really, the most basic thing is to understand your community's floodplain regulations, to be familiar with them, and to know how to use the FEMA maps in relation to enforcing your regulations. And then also ensuring that local permits are applied for any development that's proposed in a special flood hazard area, as shown on the maps. Reviewing and processing permit applications for floodplain development, and then ensuring that any development that does occur is built according to those approved permits and your community's floodplain regulations. And then also taking enforcement actions and correcting violations if and when they happen. It's also important to maintain permit records and relevant documentation as well. That is a requirement of participating in the NFIP. So as we go through this webinar, you should see how the substantial improvement provision fits into these different responsibilities as well, particularly during the part where Jennifer is talking about making the substantial improvement determinations. Okay, so now we're going to talk a bit about what exactly does substantial improvement mean. But first, I did also want to mention FEMA has a really great guidance document, the Substantial Improvement, Substantial Damage Deaths Reference. This is available online. It provides a lot of detail on this topic, and we'll be referencing it throughout this webinar. So if you're not familiar with that, do check that out. The substantial improvement provision, this definition of substantial improvement, and I'm just going to abbreviate and just call it SI a lot of the time, just so I don't have to say substantial improvement about 100 times over the course of the next hour. So the SI definition is included in your floodplain ordinance. If proposed development meets the definition of SI, then that means that the requirements in your ordinance that apply for SI, and which are the same as new construction, would need to be met for that development. And again, enforcement of this provision is a minimum NFIP requirement for all participating communities. The SI provision is a really important one in your ordinance because it's the best opportunity for older building stock to be brought up to modern flood damage resistance building standards. And this in turn reduces future costs associated with flood damage, and it also keeps people safe. So it's really your best opportunity to break the cycle of disaster damage, building back, and then buildings again being damaged and having to build back. So here on the screen here, this is the definition of substantial improvement directly from the Code of Federal Regulations. In your community ordinance, the wording may be slightly different in some cases, and that's fine, but it should include these basic things that we have in this definition here that we'll go through piece by piece now. So if we look at the first part of it, a substantial improvement means any reconstruction, rehabilitation, addition, or other improvement of a structure, the cost of which equals or exceeds 50% of the market value of the structure before the start of construction of the improvement. So basically, you're just dividing the cost of the improvement that is proposed by the pre-improvement market value of the structure to get a percentage. And if that percentage equals or exceeds 50%, then you have a substantial improvement. Jennifer is going to get into the details of what costs you should be including in when factoring the cost of improvement, and also how to determine the market value in the next section. So let's go back to our SI definition and go to the next piece of it. So the next piece is in bold here. The term SI includes structures which have incurred substantial damage regardless of the actual repair work performed. So let's take a look at the definition of substantial damage. So it's very similar to substantial improvement. It's any damage of any origin sustained by a structure whereby the cost of restoring the structure would equal or exceed 50% of the market value of the structure before the damage occurred. So similarly, you're just taking the cost of repairs, you're dividing it by the pre-damage market value of the structure to get that percentage. And if it equals or exceeds 50%, it is substantial damage, and those repairs, those improvements to the building would need to meet the requirements of your ordinance. Again, this is damage of any origin. We're not just talking about floods here. This could be damage from a fire, from a tornado, anything that's causing damage to the building can be included in this. As I said before, we're having a whole other webinar on substantial damage, so we're not going to get into details about this today. So in a couple of weeks, we'll be getting into the weeds of substantial damage and making those determinations. Okay, moving back to our substantial improvement definition, we go to the next item here in bold. The term SI does not include any project for improvement of a structure to correct existing violations of state or local health, sanitary, or safety code specifications, which have been identified by the local code enforcement official and which are the minimum necessary to assure safe living conditions. So that's very specific. And notice that we're talking about existing violations, and these are violations that have been identified by the local code enforcement official. Okay, let's move on to the last part of the definition. The term SI does not include any alteration of a historic structure, provided that the alteration will not preclude the structure's continued designation as a historic structure. So when we say historic structure, there's a specific definition included in your community floodplain ordinance that applies here. So we're not just talking about structures that are just old, and we're not just talking about structures that people just refer to it as historic because it's old. It needs to meet some specific requirements as included in the definition in your floodplain ordinance. And again, this definition here is straight from the Code of Federal Regulations. The language in your definition in your community's ordinance may be a little different, but it should include these 4 specific things. So a historic structure could include one that's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It could be listed on a state or a local inventory of historic places, or it can be a contributing structure to a registered historic district as well. FEMA actually has a whole guidance document specifically about historic structures in the NFIP that does go into a lot of detail about historic structures, and it includes the exemption from substantial improvement requirements. So we do have a link to that later on in the presentation if you're interested in learning more about this particular topic. I know we have quite a few people from Massachusetts attending this morning. So Joy Duperalt, who is the state NFIP coordinator for Massachusetts, passed along this information to us related to the state building code for Massachusetts. If there is a substantial repair of a foundation that could include repairing or replacing it, and it exceeds 50% of the perimeter of the base of the foundation, then that would actually trigger the substantial improvement clause in your regulations. So just be aware of that. And if you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to Joy. We'll have the contact information for all of the other New England state coordinators at the end of the presentation so that you have that if you don't already and you're from a different state. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jennifer, and she's going to walk you through making substantial improvement determinations.
All right, thank you, Samara. Good morning, everyone. So again, I'm going to be talking about some of the steps that communities should be making or doing when making substantial improvement determinations. So just a quick quiz. So whose responsibility is it to make substantial improvement determinations? Is it FEMA's? Is it the state, the applicant, or the community? Does anybody want to try to answer that in the chat for us?
The community.
Thank you, Kim. Or by phone, or by voice. That is correct. It is the community's responsibility to be making these determinations. We certainly know that they're not easy sometimes to make, and it can be difficult on the property owner, but they are in the interest of safety to be making these determinations. So this slide shows a summary of the 6 main steps that are involved in making a community substantial improvement determination. And I'm going to be going through each of these in more detail following this. So first of all, it's reviewing the permit application. As with all proposed development in a special flood hazard area, the community is responsible for making a determination of whether the proposed development is going to be located within a special flood hazard area, as shown on the community's current flood insurance rate map. So the community should have some kind of permitting process in place, permit application. I know a lot of communities in New Hampshire use their building permit applications that they use for other areas within the community. Some communities have adopted or are using a floodplain development permit, which we highly encourage because that will cover development that involves non-building, which is a requirement to be permitted in the community's floodplain regulations. So first, it's looking at the map, determining whether it's in the special flood hazard area. And I know on some of the permit applications, either the building permit or the floodplain permit, it has a place for the applicant to put an estimate of costs if they're doing some improvements. And improvements can be within the existing footprint of the structure, or it could be an addition. And if they are making some improvements, you need to make sure that they've submitted everything. So they may put an estimate, but that may not include everything because they don't know that they need to include certain things. So it's kind of the first step is getting that initial estimate, but then you need to work with them further to make sure that all improvements are accounted for in the process. All right, so again, I kind of mentioned this already, but some examples that may trigger this requirement, if you're if they're remodeling within the existing footprint of the structure, you do need to account for that for substantial improvement. Sometimes, it can be a complete take everything down and start again, but within the existing footprint. But if that triggers the substantial improvement determination, that would need to be worked through. Repairing foundations, lateral additions, vertical additions, and certainly repair substantial damage. And I see that I'm kind of looking at the chat as I'm going through with this, but yes, in New Hampshire on our state website, we do have an example of a floodplain permit on our website. There's several communities in New Hampshire that have that, and we can certainly help customize an application that would work for the community. So the thing to be aware of with the substantial improvement, unless you have something specifically in your ordinance about tracking or recording improvements over time, you really need to be careful about if someone's coming in and wanting to do improvements. A lot of times people find out about the 50% rule and are trying to stay under it so that they don't have to comply with the ordinance. So they really need to come in and tell you all of what they have planned. Even if they want to kind of do it over time, they really should be looking at it completely and you'll be having to account for the costs of what they propose to do. Certainly you cannot stop people from saying, oh, I'm going to do this. A couple years later, they come back and do that. If you have an issue with that, that's when you need to be considering something like cumulative substantial improvement. And that's something that Samara is going to be talking in more depth about later in the presentation. You know, I understand that people there's an additional cost of bringing structures into compliance, but there's also a safety hazard to it. And it can certainly help with people's flood insurance as well. So just need to be aware of that. If they come to you and say, well, this is what I planned, they really need to be giving you the cost of what they have planned overall. So we've developed a substantial improvement damage application packet along with a property owner guide. The floodplain permit application is good to a certain point, but if you have somebody that's looking to substantially improve, there's some other things that you need to be considering. You know, you could put it on the floodplain permit application. That's a possibility. But at the same time, it could be just another trigger to go to this other application, which is specifically with making those determinations. And it really helps to help make the process fair to all property owners and to treat all applicants consistently if you have a permit process in place specifically for substantial improvement. It also just provides you an opportunity to have the documentation that you need to have on file as a part of your responsibility as an NFIP community. So the application, it's a sample. It's something that was put together looking at applications across the country, just trying to figure out what works. It's certainly customizable. It's on our website now. It's in essentially a Word format, so you can easily customize it. It's good to use the entire packet, but we understand that some communities may not be comfortable using the entire packet, so you can just use a portion of it if that's what you feel most comfortable with. But we feel that this is a good tool to help you with the process of making those substantial improvement determinations, making sure you have everything documented as you need to be. So we encourage you to check that out. We'll have a link coming up where you can find that. And in addition, we have a property owner guide to understanding community substantial improvement, substantial damage requirements. This is kind of to help you guys not have to explain so much in detail to applicants or property owners about what those requirements are. It's a packet. Again, it can be customized specifically for the community, but it's really to give them an overview and an understanding of what the requirements are. It includes what items need to be included, what items can be excluded. So it really gives them just a really good summary and knowledge about the substantial improvement process. So verifying the cost of improvements is kind of the second step after you go through the application of getting the information about what do they want to propose, making sure that they're including all of the costs that they need to is in this step. The permit package includes what this image shows on here. It's a cost estimate of reconstruction improvement. It's really kind of just to get into that list that I was talking about, the costs to be included. This is already set up to cover all of those costs to be included so that the community and the property owner are aware of, oh yes, this is the things that we need to include. Are you going to have these type of improvements with this proposed development? So, you know, ideally you'd like, if they're having a contractor, that the contractor puts something together that will give you an idea of what these costs of improvements are. The property owner may be the one doing it, so they may need to be putting this together. But you as a community official just need to make sure and verify that these are reasonable costs and it meets the building standards for these costs. So in general, the costs to be included are the ones associated with a building. It must include all costs, even when donated or discounted. You especially see this after some type of event, like a flood event. People are trying to rebuild. There's people that will donate or discount building materials. But in all fairness, not everybody's going to have access to donated or discounted materials. So you really need to account for what are those true costs, even though you're getting it at a donated or discounted cost. It also includes labor. I know after flood events, we've had people come in, volunteers that come in and help people rebuild. But again, it gets to a fairness issue. You need to account for those labor costs, even if they are volunteered. Also, you have homeowners that are very handy and maybe can make all these improvements themselves versus somebody else who's not so handy, who has to hire a contractor. You need to make everybody on a level playing field. So you need to account for labor. Even if it's done by the property owner, they need to account for their labor in some method and account for that type of cost. So costs that are not included are generally not associated with the building. So if there's landscaping, septic, permit costs, those are not included in the substantial improvement determination. If there are documented existing violations, which have already been documented by the building official in the community, this can't be something that just comes up as a result of the substantial improvement. These should be already documented and existing. And FEMA has, in that substantial improvement, substantial damage desk reference, that Samara reference, it gets into a lot more detail about this specific exclusion. But so if you have something that comes up like this, I highly recommend looking at that reference document. But just giving you a heads up that that is part of the exclusions. Again, that substantial damage desk reference is the best resource that you can have. It has all the costs that must be included, costs that can be excluded. It's certainly not exhaustive, but it will give you certainly an idea of what needs to be included when making a substantial improvement determination. The second piece of a substantial improvement determination is the market value of the structure. As Samara pointed out with the definition, you have to compare the improvements in relationship to the market value. So there are certain, again, that desk reference goes into a lot more detail about market value, so I encourage you to look at that. In general, communities should already have an idea of what market value you're going to be using for substantial improvements. This should not be coming up as applications come in. You should already be in agreement with what market value you're going to be using to ensure that it's fair for everybody. In New Hampshire, most communities that I'm aware of are using the assessed value of just the structure. You do not include the land. So a lot of communities in New Hampshire are using the assessed value, and that's an acceptable market value. Having a professional appraisal by a licensed professional appraiser is probably slightly better, but we know the challenges of having to do that with every substantial improvement. Some communities may choose to use market value kind of as a starting point and may want to get more further into depth depending on the situation. And certainly if an applicant just does not disagree with the market value that the community is using with the assessed value, so if they don't agree with assessed value, they certainly have the option of hiring a property appraisal to submit a property appraisal at their own cost. At that point, the community still has some say in that. If you're reviewing it, maybe you get your assessment department involved, and if there's just some questions or if there's some uneasiness about what they've submitted, certainly there could be a next step, possibly a third party that can help resolve the issue that's not related to the property owner, not related to the community. So it's a possible. But you gotta have to the community and the property owner kind of need to work together and be in agreement about what the market value of that structure is. Ultimately, it's with the community because it is your regulations, but you just want to make sure that the property owner is also comfortable as well with that process. So in the end, you're taking your total cost of those improvements, dividing by that and I forgot to mention that when you're looking at the market value of the structure, it should be as a result of the pre-improvement. So the market value of that structure before you make those improvements is what you're needed to be looking at. So you compare those costs and then you come up with your percentage. Does that percentage equal or exceed 50%? If it does, then it's considered a substantial improvement. If it doesn't meet that 50%, then it's not considered a substantial improvement. It gets a little more when you're within that, when you're in very close to that 50%, especially in that 40% range. There may be some things you can do to help feel more easy about this. You may want to look at looking at a different type of market value, making sure that you're good. But it's good just to make sure that you have all the costs and you're comfortable with the market value. But there is some further guidance if the community ends up being a little concerned about it being just so close to that 50%. So it's good practice to issue a letter to the property owner regarding the community's substantial improvement determination, even if it's determined not to be a substantial improvement. The community needs to have documentation on file anyways regarding your substantial improvement determinations. So this is just a way to have that documented and in your files. It also is very helpful for the property owner to have that documentation as well. The substantial improvement, substantial damage that's referenced includes some really good sample letters. So I encourage you to take a look at those and feel free to use those with the letters that you issue. Certainly, as with any administrative decision made by the building official or community official, it can be appealed to the Zoning Board of Adjustments, as I'm referring as in New Hampshire. So that is always an option when you have an administrative decision being made. So with best practices, we highly recommend, especially having some kind of written procedures. You may have heard that we had developed some sample administrative procedures for floodplain development in general for communities that participate in the program. It does include a section about substantial improvement and substantial damage, determination procedures. This is just a good way, especially if you have somebody who's making the determinations now that may leave, and then you have someone new coming in. It would just make it much easier to have them written down so that when somebody new comes in, they can kind of pick up where the last person left off. And it maintains a consistent and fair process in the community. Again, this is all about the application process, having the property owner guide, and just having these procedures is just a good way to protect the community, to remain consistent, and have the documentation that they need on file. All right. So if you've determined that a proposed development is going to be a substantial improvement, the way they have to make those improvements to that structure is as if it was new construction. So obviously, if you have a structure that was built before the community had floodplain regulations in place, there may be a lot more work involved with bringing that structure into compliance. We have a lot of basements in New Hampshire and in New England. So if someone's looking to substantially improve, they're going to have to look at getting rid of that basement. And Samara has some scenarios that are coming up, and it'll show an illustration of something that needs to be done. But typically, that is probably the most involved process in bringing a structure into compliance as of new construction, is if there is a basement involved. In New Hampshire, with our 2015 state building code, there is a statewide freeboard requirement of 1 foot above base flood elevation. So if you enforce the state building code in your community, please be aware that that is that 1 foot requirement is going above base flood elevation. So a substantially improved structure will need to have that lowest floor elevated up to that point. Again, basement's not allowed. If you need to raise a floor up to get it to that required elevation, enclosures below that elevation are allowed. They have to meet certain criteria, including the floor has to be at grade at one side. It has to have a certain number of flood vents in there as well. You also need to be aware of protecting any utilities that need to be elevated up, and the use of flood damage resistant materials for any portion of that structure that is below that required elevation. There are also specific requirements for certain zones. Certainly if someone has a structure in a V zone that did not have to comply with V zone standards to start with, you're going to be looking at a certain set of requirements, including piers and columns. So sometimes when property owners find out about what they need to do to bring it into compliance, that's when they kind of back off on some of their improvements. But again, that's where you want to just be clear with them that if whatever they're proposing or ultimately want to propose, that they need to be considerate of that in making these determinations. So if you have somebody that's proposing work, you need to make sure that they're submitting the information that they need to be compliant as if it was new construction. So once they've shown that they are going to be proposing the improvements and making these improvements in a way that it meets the new construction standards of the ordinance, then that's when the permit for that can be issued. So in cases where the proposed improvements do not result in a substantial improvement determination, they do not need to comply with the regulations as if it was new construction. There still are some certain minimum standards in your ordinance. If it's not a substantial improvement that they still would need to meet for you to issue a permit. That one requirement that all federal and state permits that have been received still kick in. If there's a floodway involved, there's some requirements there. So you just need to make sure there's still going to be some minimum standards. They're not completely not having to comply with the ordinance, but they wouldn't have to comply as if it was new construction with the elevation of that lowest floor. It's still good to encourage the property owner to consider certain mitigation measures when they are doing improvements that are below that substantial improvement determination. Because chances are it may be a structure that was built before the regulations, so it's still an at-risk property or structure. So there's some things like protecting building utility systems that they could do. But certainly if they're going to be doing these mitigation measures and they didn't account for it before in their cost improvement, you'll just need to make sure that those the cost of that mitigation is included with their total cost. If they decide, that you go through the substantial improvement determination based on certain costs, and down the line they're like, oh, well, maybe I'll elevate my utilities. You may need to go back and do a redetermination of costs if they decide to do that later. It may not result in a substantial improvement, but at least you have that documentation that you did consider those additional costs. So within the enforcement So I know some communities don't have building officials, may not have some inspections, but communities really need to ensure that they figure out some kind of process for all development in the special flood hazard area, but especially with substantial improvements that we all know that things pop up during construction. Somebody thinks, oh, well, I should do this, or they discover a problem and they're going to have to fix it along the way. So the costs are starting to go up. So there needs to be some kind of checking in during the construction process to ensure that what the property owner has proposed, what they're permitted for, is remaining the same. If there are any changes or some additional costs, they're going to have to stop work. You're going to need to go back, account for these additional costs, figure out, these additional improvements, are they meeting the requirements in the ordinance? So just to be aware of that. I know we have some communities that don't have building inspectors, but again, you need to have some kind of process in place. Whether it's you have your fire department going out, taking pictures and having the person issuing the permit, the entity issuing the permits, taking a look at that, making sure that what's happening is actually what they've been permitted for. So that's really important. Also, in compliance with the ordinance, you also need to have the as-built elevation on file. So when they're done with their improvements, they need to come back to the community and submit those as-built elevation information so that you can be sure that what they did actually meets the ordinance requirements. There can be certain ramifications if things are not done in compliance with the ordinance. For property owners, certainly it's the insurance side. They can certainly, a reality check comes when you have to get insurance and your structure does not comply with the ordinance. I had a case where somebody got the permit from the town, went out, and again, things changed. What they gave the town as what they proposed to do completely changed during construction. They came back to the town, gave them the elevation certificate. It showed the lowest floor now 8 feet below base flood elevation. The town was like, whoa, what just happened here? And in turn, the property owner had to get flood insurance, and that flood insurance accounted for the fact that it was 8 feet below base flood elevation. So that is a ramification on the property owner side. On the community side, you have agreed to enforce and adopt those regulations. So if you're not doing what you need to be doing, certainly there's ramifications there. We never like to get to that point. That's why Samara and I are here to help communities, make sure you're meeting your requirements. And certainly FEMA is available as well to help make sure that it doesn't get to that point. So again, there's certain documentation that needs to be maintained. Any of the permit applications, supporting documentation, you need to remain on file with the property. Those determinations, that as-built elevation I mentioned for after the construction is completed. If for some reason a variance from the floodplain regulations is submitted, documentation of that variance and the result of that variance needs to be on file, and any other documentation or certifications that are required as noted in your floodplain ordinance need to be on file as well. So this is just a good flow chart of kind of what I just described. You're looking at the cost, you're dividing it by the market value, what happens when it's greater than 50%, what happens if it's less than 50%. So it kind of works you through that process. Again, this comes from the desk reference. I use that desk reference all the time in answering questions about substantial improvement. It has a lot of detail, so I encourage you to take a look at that. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to Samara, who will go over some of the scenarios.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. So in these scenarios, we're We're assuming that a substantial improvement determination has been made, and these are all substantial improvements. So let's take a look at our first scenario here. In this one, if you look on the before picture to the left, you see that there have been the improvements that have been made will be within the existing footprint of the structure. There's no additions or anything like that. So in order to make this building compliant with the minimum requirements that are included in your floodplain ordinance, what would need to be done, you would need to elevate the lowest floor to the base flood elevation, or in New Hampshire, it'd be the BFE plus 1 foot because we have that state building code requirement. And if you're not in New Hampshire, you may have a similar requirement to that in your state building code, and you'd want to check on that if you didn't know. Also, you'll see that, like Jennifer was talking about, we'll need to have these compliant flood openings in the enclosure below that lowest floor. And you'll also see that the HVAC system has been elevated to the base flood elevation as well. If your community has higher standards that you've incorporated into your floodplain ordinance, and they do apply for substantial improvements, then those requirements would also need to be met as well. So here's another scenario where in the before picture here, I guess this is the side view of the building, but you have a basement that's below grade. It's below grade on all sides, so it meets that NFIP definition of a basement. So you have the lowest floor way below the base flood elevation. So if you look on the right in the after, you'll see that that basement has been filled to grade, and what used to be the second floor is now the lowest floor, and you have those flood openings added in that enclosed space below the lowest floor as well. For lateral additions, you have there are two different scenarios here. On the left, you have a situation where the lateral addition is structurally connected to the original building. So the load-bearing structure of that addition is connected to the load-bearing structure of the original house. So in a situation like that, the addition and the existing building would be required to comply with your community's current floodplain ordinance requirements. So in this case, you'd be elevating the lowest floor of both the addition and the original building to the base flood elevation, or whatever the required elevation would be, adding compliant flood openings. On the right, you have a situation where you have an addition that is not structurally connected. So meaning the load-bearing structures are separate. For the common wall, the only change that's occurring is you're adding in that doorway between the two. And so in a case like that, the addition would need to meet the requirements of your current floodplain ordinance, but the original building would not need to meet those requirements. If you look in the DES reference that we've been talking about, there is a lot of information about these different scenarios. In fact, I've taken these graphics straight from that DES reference, so they'll look familiar if you go to that. But definitely, if you have situations like that, that's a very good guide to get more information on. For a vertical addition, here we have a situation before the lowest floor is below the base flood elevation, and on the right, after the lowest floor has been raised. This if we assume this is a V zone, since the building is on piers and pilings, the foundation type was compliant before, but you could have situations where if it's an older building, it may not have been built on piers or pilings. If it's in a V zone, then that would need to be changed as part of since it's a substantial improvement, and it would need to be placed on piers and pilings. For a non-residential structure, if it's in a zone that starts with the letter A, there would be the option to, instead of elevating to that required elevation, to instead dry floodproof to the elevation, meaning making it watertight. That option isn't available in a V zone, just in A zones. Okay, so just wanted to talk a bit about going beyond minimum NFIP standards. So I mentioned before that the SI and SD provisions are really the key way that you can reduce risk to existing structures. So we do recommend considering adopting higher standards that will increase the effectiveness of these provisions. So let's take a look at a couple of those. The first one is making the substantial improvement definition cumulative so that its improvements are captured over the course of a certain time frame, like 3, 5, or 10 years or whatever. And this can help prevent property owners from splitting up improvement projects that ultimately may circumvent the SI requirement, like Jennifer was talking about earlier. One thing, before you do this, you want to make sure that you have detailed written procedures on how exactly you'll be tracking the improvements cumulatively. And again, I would recommend taking a look at the DOS reference for some more information about this. For communities that are in the community rating system, CRS, there is credit available for adding a cumulative SI clause in your ordinance and enforcing it. The maximum credit is 90 points. So here we have an example of how you could modify the existing substantial improvement definition in your ordinance to make it cumulative. So in the first part, for example, you would just need to decide on how long that period would be that you'd be tracking them cumulatively. So as I said before, it could be 3 years, it could be 10 years, whatever your community feels comfortable with. And then at the end of the definition, you'd also want to include the date that this revision would be effective. Another option for a higher standard related to substantial improvements is adopting language where you're lowering the threshold that triggers the SI requirement. So instead of 50%, you could have 40% or 30%, so that the SI clause in your ordinance is triggered with a lower cost of improvements. So again, there's more information in the DOS reference. There is credit for this activity under CRS as well, but it's only 20 points. But this is a lot easier to do. If you want to make the change, you're just decreasing the percentage from 50 to something below that. So it's pretty straightforward. Okay, just wanted to point out a few resources, and then we'll have time for questions. Again, we've got the DOS reference. Another good FEMA publication about this is answers to questions about substantially improved and substantially damaged buildings. And we've been talking about our website as well. We have a page we just posted up there recently that's specifically about substantial improvements, and that includes the application packet and property owner guide that Jennifer was talking about. Some other useful FEMA publications that we referenced during this presentation, protecting building utilities from flood damage and flood damage resistant materials requirements are helpful for situations where if an improvement doesn't reach the SI threshold, this can give people ideas on flood protection measures they may want to do anyways. And there's also the floodplain management bulletin on historic structures that I mentioned before, where it gives more information about the NFIP and historic structures and that exemption from the SI requirement that's in the SI definition. I've listed our contact information here. You all should have my email address because I assume since I sent out the webinar information to you all and registered you. But if you don't have it, there it is. And also, again, I know we have quite a few people from other states on the meeting. So here's the contact information for the other state NFIP coordinators. Again, there may be some specific state requirements that apply that you definitely want to check in with them if you're not completely familiar with what those are. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording.